Picture this. You are standing at the edge of a campfire somewhere in Africa. It is roughly 70,000 years ago. The sun has gone down, the predators are out there in the dark doing predator things, and your group of about 25 people are gathered in the firelight, eating, talking in whatever proto-language you use, managing the social dynamics of a small band of humans who have to get along or die. Now look around that fire. Really look. You see children, several of them, ranging from infants to maybe 10 or 11 years old. You see adults in their 20s and 30s, physically strong, doing most of the hunting and foraging and carrying. You see a couple of people who are clearly older, maybe in their 50s, maybe a little beyond, who carry themselves with the particular authority that comes from knowing things the younger people don't know yet. And here is the question that this scene raises. How old is the oldest person at that fire going to get? Because you have probably heard the answer to this question somewhere, and the answer you heard was almost certainly wrong. Not slightly wrong, not off by a few years, wrong in a way that changes the entire picture of what ancient human life actually looked like. Who was in a band, what roles existed, what knowledge got preserved, and what ancient humans were actually capable of over a lifetime. The answer you probably heard is something like 35, maybe 40 at the outside. The ancient world was brutal. The logic goes, everyone died young, ancient humans were essentially used up by middle age, and anything resembling old age was rare to the point of being practically mythological. That answer is a statistic that has been catastrophically misunderstood. And today we are going to take it apart completely. Look at what the actual evidence shows about how long ancient humans lived, what killed them when they died, and what it meant to grow old in a world that had none of the things we associate with keeping people alive. This one is going to surprise you. Let's go. The number you have heard, the one that says ancient humans lived to around 30 or 35 years, is real. It is not made up. It appears consistently in research on ancient and hunter-gatherer populations, and it represents a genuine statistical calculation based on real data. The problem is that it is being interpreted to mean something it does not mean. That number is life expectancy at birth. And life expectancy at birth is one of the most misunderstood statistics in popular discussion of human history. To understand why it is so frequently misinterpreted, we need to spend a moment on what it actually measures and what it doesn't. Life expectancy at birth is the average number of years a newborn can be expected to live, calculated by averaging the ages at death of everyone in a given population. It sounds straightforward. The problem is what happens when you average those ages across a population with very high infant and child mortality. In ancient human populations, infant and child mortality was staggering by any modern comparison. Researchers studying both the skeletal record from ancient burial sites and the documented mortality patterns of modern hunter-gatherer communities that still live traditional lifestyles have found consistently that somewhere between 40 and 50% of children died before reaching the age of 15. In some populations and some conditions, the number was higher. The first year of life was particularly dangerous. Infections, accidents, predator attacks on infants, nutritional failures during weaning, and complications of birth itself killed a substantial fraction of every generation before their first birthday. Now here is the mathematics that explains everything. If you are calculating the average age at death across a population where roughly half the people die before age 15, many of them as infants dying at age 0, 1, or 2, the average gets pulled down dramatically regardless of how long the surviving adults live. The average of 0 and 70 is 35. The fact that the average is 35 tells you almost nothing useful about what the person who made it to adulthood could expect. This is not a subtle statistical point. It is a fundamental misreading of what the number means. And it has produced a wildly distorted popular image of ancient human life as uniformly brief and brutish in ways that the actual evidence does not support. Let's look at what the evidence actually shows when you correct for this misinterpretation and ask the right question. The right question is not, what was the average age at death across the entire population? The right question is, for an ancient human who survived childhood and reached adulthood, what could they realistically expect in terms of lifespan? The answer, drawn from multiple independent research streams, is dramatically different from the 35-year myth. The most comprehensive study of hunter-gatherer lifespan was conducted by researchers Michael Gervin and Hillard Kaplan in 2007, using actual records of deaths from multiple modern hunter-gatherer societies rather than theoretical calculations. Their findings were striking enough that they directly contradicted a century of assumptions about ancient human lifespan. For hunter-gatherers who survived to adulthood, the modal age of death life. The most common age at which adults died was between 68 and 78 years. Not 35, 68 to 78. Read that again. The most common age at which adult hunter-gatherers died was in their late 60s to late 70s. Ancient human adults, in a world with no medicine, no hospitals, no antibiotics, no emergency services, and no food delivery apps, were regularly living into what we would recognize as old age. The skeletal evidence from ancient burial sites supports this picture. Forensic analysis of ancient human remains, examining bone density, joint wear, dental wear patterns, and other markers of biological age, consistently identifies individuals who died in their 50s, 60s, and occasionally beyond. The markers of advanced age in bone are well established and reliable. When archaeologists find ancient skeletons showing the joint degeneration, bone density loss, and dental wear consistent with old age, those individuals were old, and those individuals appear regularly in ancient burial populations. Ancient humans got old, not as frequently as modern humans in wealthy countries with excellent healthcare, not as reliably as someone born today in Japan or Norway or Australia, but regularly enough that old age was a normal and expected stage of life for ancient humans who had the good fortune, and it was fortune in significant measure, to survive childhood. Now here is the question that naturally follows. If adult ancient humans could and did live into their late 60s and 70s, what was actually killing them when they died? Because if it wasn't simply age, and in many cases it wasn't, then what was the specific landscape of threats that ancient adults were navigating through their lives? The honest answer is a list that has several items on it, and their relative importance varied depending on the specific group, the specific environment, and the specific period. Disease was the most consistent killer. Infectious disease in particular, respiratory infections, gastrointestinal pathogens, parasitic infections, accounted for the majority of deaths in most documented hunter-gatherer populations. Studies of modern hunter-gatherer groups consistently find that disease represents somewhere between 45 and 85% of all deaths depending on the group and conditions. Respiratory infections, what we might broadly categorize as pneumonia and related conditions, were major killers. Gastrointestinal infections from contaminated water and food were significant. Parasitic infections were chronic and occasionally fatal. Ancient humans had no antibiotics. An infection that a modern person would treat with a course of medication and a few days of rest could kill an ancient human in days. A wound that became infected, and wounds in a physically demanding hunter-gatherer lifestyle were common, was a potential death sentence. The absence of any effective treatment for bacterial infection meant that conditions modern people regard as minor inconveniences were, for ancient humans, genuine mortal threats. What ancient humans almost certainly did not experience in significant numbers was the modern epidemic of chronic disease. Heart disease, type 2, diabetes, many common cancers, obesity-related conditions, these are overwhelmingly diseases of the modern lifestyle, driven by processed food, sedentary behavior, chronic stress, and environmental factors that simply did not exist in a hunter-gatherer context. The ancient human who survived to old age was almost certainly lean and physically capable well into their later decades in ways that modern elderly people, shaped by decades of processed food and sedentary jobs, typically are not. The evidence from analysis of ancient human skeletons is consistent on this point. Ancient human bones from adults show remarkably low rates of the bone density loss associated with sedentary modern lifestyles. Markers of systemic inflammation, which are associated with modern chronic disease, are largely absent in ancient skeletal populations. Ancient adults who lived to old age appear, from the physical evidence, to have aged differently than modern people do, more gradually, more robustly, with physical capacity maintained into later life to a degree that the modern epidemic of lifestyle disease prevents in many contemporary people. Violence was another significant cause of ancient human death, and the evidence here is more disturbing than most people are comfortable with. Skeletal evidence from ancient human burial sites around the world shows consistent signs of interpersonal violence. Healed and unhealed fractures, embedded projectile points, skull injuries with patterns consistent with deliberate attack, injuries to the back of the skull suggesting attack from behind. Violence between individual humans and between groups was a regular feature of ancient human life, not a rare exception. Research on modern hunter-gatherer societies shows significant variation in rates of violent death, but the numbers are sobering across virtually every group studied. In some hunter-gatherer populations, violence accounts for the majority of adult deaths, particularly in young adult males, where competition over mates, resources, and group status drove levels of lethal conflict that produced mortality rates by violence that dwarf those of modern developed countries. In others, violence represents a smaller fraction but is still a consistently present cause of death across all documented groups. This is one of those pieces of evidence about ancient human life that popular romanticizations tend to minimize or explain away. The notion of ancient humans living in peaceful harmony with each other before civilization introduced conflict is not supported by the archaeological record. Ancient human skulls show healed injuries. Ancient human spines show embedded points. The bones tell a story of regular violence between individuals and between groups that was woven into the fabric of ancient social life, regardless of how uncomfortable that fact is to acknowledge. This doesn't mean ancient humans were incapable of cooperation, compassion, or complex positive social bonds. The evidence equally clearly shows that they were. It means they were human, and humans, across every context ever studied, are capable of both profound cooperation and profound violence, often toward different people at the same time. Accidents were the third major category of ancient human death, and in a world where the daily activities of life involved everything that modern safety regulations have spent a century trying to prevent, accidents were both common and frequently fatal. Falling was a major risk. Ancient humans climbed trees for food and observation, crossed rivers and rocky terrain, navigated cliff faces and unstable ground as regular parts of their movement through the landscape. A fall that results in a broken leg or hip is, for a modern person, an inconvenience managed by a hospital and physical therapy. For an ancient human, a broken leg was a catastrophic injury that could mean immobility in a world that required constant movement, dependence on others who might not always be able to sustain that dependence, and a significant probability of a secondary complication. Infection, starvation, predator attack, that would be fatal. Drowning was a real risk in a world where water sources were central to survival and had to be crossed regularly without bridges or boats in many contexts. Animal attacks, from the predators that ancient humans shared landscapes with, from the prey animals they hunted, from snakes and insects and other hazards of the wild environment, produced a steady stream of traumatic injuries, some of which were fatal directly, and others of which became fatal through infection. The physical evidence from ancient skeletons shows high rates of healed fractures in many populations: arms, legs, ribs, vertebrae showing the bone remodeling that indicates a break that was survived. These healed fractures tell us something important. Ancient humans regularly experienced traumatic injuries, and a significant fraction of them survived those injuries, sometimes with help from others, sometimes on their own. The evidence of care for the injured, discussed earlier in this channel's history, appears here again. Ancient humans who survived serious fractures often show the kind of healing that suggests they were not mobile during recovery, which means others were providing food and protection during the healing period. Here is the piece of ancient human lifespan that changes everything else about how we understand ancient social life, and it almost never gets the attention it deserves. Old people. In a world where we've established that somewhere between 40 and 50% of people die before reaching adulthood, and where adults face a landscape of disease, violence, and accident that produces significant ongoing mortality throughout the adult years, the people who made it to old age, to their 60s and beyond, were not merely survivors. They were repositories. Ancient human communities had no writing. They had no libraries, no external records of any kind, no way to preserve knowledge except in the living memories and practiced skills of the people who held that knowledge. Everything the community knew about where to find water during a drought, which plants were medicinal and in what doses, how to read the landscape for signs of predator activity, which routes through difficult terrain were passable in different seasons, how to navigate to distant resources their grandparents had known about. All of it lived in human memory. All of it died when the person who held it died. An elder in an ancient human community was not a burden. They were a library. A grandmother who had survived into her 60s had lived through more seasons, more droughts, more conflicts, more ecological variations than anyone else in the group. She had seen things the young adults had never encountered. She remembered solutions to problems that hadn't arisen yet. She knew which years the river had flooded and what it looked like before it did. She knew which distant groups were safe to trade with and which had caused violence in the past. She knew which children in the group were hers and her daughters, and which therefore carried her genetic line forward and deserved her investment. The grandmother hypothesis in evolutionary biology, the idea that postmenopausal women live long lives, specifically because their knowledge and caregiving contribute so significantly significantly to grandchild survival that genes for extended female lifespan are strongly selected for, captures something important about this. Ancient old people were not accidents or anomalies. They were functional, valued, evolutionarily significant members of their communities whose presence increased the group's survival probability in ways that went well beyond their direct physical contribution. This is why old age exists in humans at all, not as a biological accident, not as something that civilization created by keeping people alive past their natural purpose. As an evolved feature of human social organization, present in our lineage for at least as long as we have been recognizably human, because communities with knowledgeable old people survived better than communities without them. Let's bring this all together into the clearest possible picture of what ancient human lifespan actually looked like. Ancient humans were born into a world that was extremely dangerous for infants and children. Roughly half of every generation died before reaching adulthood. The specific threats, infection, accident, predator attack, nutritional failure, were relentless, and in most cases, untreatable. The average life expectancy at birth, calculated across the entire population including all those infant and child deaths, was somewhere between 25 and 40 years depending on the specific group and conditions. That number tells you about the childhood death rate. It does not tell you about adult lifespan. An ancient human who survived childhood and reached adulthood faced a different, though still substantial, landscape of risks. Disease, violence, and accident continued to kill throughout adulthood. Infection, violence, and accidents were the primary causes of death in ancient populations, and adult mortality rates roughly doubled every 8 to 10 years as people aged. But many people navigated all of these risks and lived into genuine old age. The most rigorous research available puts the modal adult lifespan in the late 60s to late 70s, similar in many ways to pre-industrial European populations of the 18th century. Those ancient old people were not fragile in the way that many modern elderly people are. They were lean, physically active, nutritionally fed by a diverse wild diet that produced none of the chronic inflammatory conditions of modern lifestyle disease. They were cognitively sharp in ways that genuine old age in a hunter-gatherer context required. You could not survive to 70 in the ancient world on declining faculties. The mental and physical demands of the life didn't permit it, and they were respected in ways that modern societies, with their institutional knowledge storage and their complicated relationship with elderly people, sometimes struggle to replicate. In a world where everything that mattered was stored in human memory, the person with the most memory was the most valuable person in the room. The real answer to how long ancient humans actually lived is this. It depended enormously on when in the lifespan you were asking the question. If you were asking at birth, the answer was genuinely uncertain and statistically grim. The coin flip of childhood was real, and many did not win it. If you were asking at 15, having made it past the most dangerous period, the answer changed dramatically. A 15-year-old ancient human who had successfully navigated the gauntlet of childhood could reasonably expect several more decades of life. Not with certainty, the landscape of adult risks was real and unforgiving, but with genuine probability. And if you were asking at 45 or 50, having survived everything the world had thrown at you for half a century, if you were the kind of person who made it that far in that environment, the answer was that you might well see another 2 decades, maybe more. Ancient humans who reached middle age were not racing toward an imminent biological cliff. Many of them had years ahead of them, years spent being the most important people in their communities, the holders of irreplaceable knowledge, the grandmothers and grandfathers whose presence made survival more likely for everyone around them. The ancient world was brutal. It was dangerous in ways that are difficult to fully appreciate from the vantage point of modern medicine and modern safety. It killed people, especially children, in numbers that should produce genuine grief in anyone who thinks carefully about it. But it did not uniformly kill people young. It did not prevent old age, and the old people it produced, the ones who navigated everything and came out the other side, were some of the most remarkable human beings who have ever lived. Not in spite of the world they inhabited, but precisely because of it.